Good evening all, and welcome. I'm sure plenty of us have some horror stories regarding exes that we would rather forget. Now, something I'm going to warn you of. The first 3 stories are rather short, and the 4th story is what I would describe as an epic. It is a very good, very well written story that deserves to be listened to. It is extremely long, but if you make it to the end, you'll realize that it was worth your time. I do hope that you enjoy. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I split up with my ex of 2 years, I decided that because we were friends before, we'd remain friends after. Big mistake. He changed my email recoveries to his email, so I couldn't change my password. He looked at my Google Chrome passwords and wrote them all down. Regularly checked my emails, Facebook messages and everything. After we split up, he was physically violent, so I told my mum to ban him from the house. He was still doing bits for her while I was at work, visiting often because we were friendly. When he asked me when he'd be able to see me again, I always told him soon, and put him off because of the nature of our breakup. The violence scared me to my core. I was a changed person. I felt trapped. Then, he didn't make it any worse when he climbed over my back garden fence and knocked on my window and demanded to be let in. It got to the point that even after a few months after we'd split up, and after I'd not seen him in roughly 3 months, I'd arrange a date with a guy. The date was awful, but that's another story. My ex left multiple messages on my phone, and after the date had finished, he asked me where I was. I answered that I was in town, and he had apparently read my messages to this guy on the dating site I used, got his number, and called him multiple times after. He also messaged my mother, telling her that I was on a date with a stranger. I also remember he turned up at the train station, saw me meeting this guy, and then he left. He wanted to surprise me, apparently. When we were together, he also found out some things about my past, and when an old flame messaged me on Facebook, he and I got into an argument. He was staying over at the time, and stormed out of the room to shout in my mother's face that I was a filthy cheater. I'm so glad that's over now. Me and my ex-boyfriend met in 2016. He was actually still going out with someone else at the time, although it was pretty obvious that he was into me. But I told him that we couldn't get together until his girlfriend was out the picture. If he wanted to be more than friends, that is. He literally threw her things out of his house. She moved in there without his knowledge or approval, you see. But she kept on going back, saying that she would kill herself and so on if he ever left her. Him being extremely nice and naive took her back again and again and again. Every time it was the same. She would call him every 10 minutes, knowing he was at work, calling him all kinds of horrible things. He had such low self-esteem because of her, and that was sad. He was struggling a lot, and I thought he'd never be able to get rid of her. So I told him we could not see each other anymore, even as friends. I knew that this would trigger him, and it did. And he was finally able to leave her for good, and then we started dating. After a few weeks, his ex's mother called from another country, saying her daughter tried to kill herself because of him. She even left a note, and that she was in the hospital and needs to call her now, because at 9 p.m. she would be conscious. And that he needs to call her at 9 p.m. because then she'll be conscious. We checked the police reports from a few days prior, and guess what? No suicide attempts were made, so he didn't do anything. 3 days later, her friends call him, saying she's on the hills in the house and that she's gonna jump. He told them not to bother him, and the next day she started showing up at the place we work, as we both cook in a restaurant, and she stayed there all day every day all summer. We quit working there, so she started coming to our house, as we were living together at this point, and started breaking everything. When she saw this, and how it wasn't helping her situation, she started calling from hidden numbers. At the time, we just learned to stop answering. She then told us that her mother disowned her in an attempt to get back with him. This didn't work out either. Then she began coming over to our new place every day, and this went on for a year. At this point, we're expecting our first child, and honestly, I don't know what to expect from her. I laughed for the most part at this, but it really became ridiculous. To give you some backstory, I'm from a small town of about 3,000 people. However, we are just 15 minutes away from a D1 SEC school and huge towns next to us. We also get the property tax from a neighboring town and have $1 million school. I played football for my high school and actually ended up taking the receiver's coach's daughter to my senior prom. I started talking to her about midway through my senior year, and she was a sophomore. Her parents never knew much about it, but I knew they knew we were a thing. The summer before college, things shot bad. It was just a rough time, and things ended. So come freshman year, my ex texts my mum, asking how I am. So come freshman year, my ex-girlfriend's mum texts me on Facebook asking how I am, the coach's wife. The conversation continues and ends about an hour later, just seemingly a checkup. The next day passes, another message, and longer conversation. I don't want to be rude and say leave me alone, so I just keep replying. This goes on until she tells me she has feelings for me and wants me. So not only did the coach's daughter want me, so did his wife. Now, if that is not some Lifetime drama stuff in real life, I don't know what is. My name is Crysty, and at the time of this series of events occurred, I was stationed in Yokosuka, Japan, as a Navy corpsman or military medic. It started in June of 1992, when I was 21. And continued until Thanksgiving 1993, when I was 22. But looking back, it's hard to believe that only 18 months could haunt the rest of my life. I have severe post-traumatic stress disorder from the first serving in the Persian Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, and reinforced by the events I am about to tell you. Thus, I have severe paranoia as well. I'm on medication and will be for life, despite the numerous rounds of counseling I've attended over the years. Also, let me say that I come from a long line of women on my mother's side who can sense things. Most people can't. Normally I wouldn't mention it, but this comes important several times, and saved me from assault and death during this series of events. So it's important, no matter how skeptical you might be of it. Anyway, I lived in Japan on the naval base there, in the Corpsman Barracks, building 1407. My room consisted of a 2-person open area, with a smaller closed room containing shower stall and toilet situated next to the front door. The front door led into the hall, and I lived on the 3rd floor. My window looked out onto the hospital parking lot and the back staff entrance of the hospital. Facing the hospital, the inside stairwell led down to the guard desk before going out to the parking lot. The opposite end of the hall had an outside stairwell which led onto a road and seawell overlooking the water. I had arrived in Japan of November 1991, and by the time June of 1992 came around, I had made many male friends amongst both of the hospital corpsmen living in the barracks and the enlisted servicemen off some of the ships in the dock. Most notably, I had become good gaming friends with a group of guys from the USS Blue Ridge, the command ship of the 7th Fleet. Among these men was a tall, reasonably nice-looking man named James Vernon Dickey. He was a loner that others had seemed to avoid, though I couldn't figure out why. I figured he was just a loner and a bit strange, but harmless, so I would invite him to join in our games at the Enlisted Club, or A Club. No one protested the invitations, and Jim seemed to enjoy playing with us. Now, I was also extremely lonely. Despite my many friends, I was incredibly homesick. As a bit of pertinent information, let me just say that my 2 sisters were both pregnant while I was in Japan, but for reasons I shouldn't divulge, had asked me to take their babies if something should happen. I agreed, and looked forward to being a part of the children's lives, though hoped desperately it wouldn't be necessary to take on these kids, because that would mean something terrible had happened to either sister. This is very significant, because I was dreaming of a family of my own, with kids and such, but had no significant other. Then, Jim proposed to me in June 1992. I jumped at the offer. I know, not the best reason to marry someone, but I could think of worse, so I agreed to marry him. I told my other friends, and they seemed hesitant and worried, but congratulated us. Well, except a Blue Ridge enlisted man we called Cowboy. He was Jim's best friend, and was genuinely glad for Jim and me. In fact, Cowboy was the only one who didn't see Jim as strange. I figured everyone else was nervous, because we'd only known each other for 6 months, so I shrugged it off. When Jim asked me when we should get married, I told him August. This made him happy, until I clarified that I meant August of 1994, over a year and a half away. I wanted to be married at my mother's house, like my older sister had. Jim frowned and seemed disappointed and almost angry, but gave in to my wishes. Then Jim's behavior began to get really weird, though, at the time, I figured he had a strange sense of humor and didn't express himself very well. First off, we went to look for an engagement ring, and when we saw one I loved immediately, Jim claimed to have no money on him, so I bought the ring. We went next to the grocery store and picked up on $300 worth of snacks and drinks for my friends. I always provided this to encourage the guys to hang out at my place instead of going out drinking. When we got to the counter, I realized I had used all my cash already for the ring. Without stopping or pausing, Jim called out, "Crysty, give me your ATM card. I'll go to get the money from your account." I handed it over, and he turned to the man at the register. "I'm leaving her as collateral." He then walked out the door, never even asking for my password. The cashier looked at me with a very odd expression, and I tried to laugh it off. "Well, I guess I'm worth about $300. He nodded and gave me an uncomfortable chuckle, but didn't argue. The store wasn't busy, so there was no problem with me just standing there waiting. Jim came back in half an hour, paid the money, which upon later checking he had removed successfully from my account, and nothing extra was gone. And I didn't think much about the fact that he had known my password without asking. Soon, he brought over a new VCR, and claimed it was his engagement gift to me. I didn't even have one before that, so it was nice but a bit odd. I didn't question the practicality, but I did get a bit peeved that he immediately sat down to watch a movie without consulting what I wanted to see. It turned out he picked a film I didn't like, and I let it go, not wanting to fight over something so stupid. His next gift was a yellow rose in a water globe paperweight. It was beautiful. Yellow roses are my favorite flower, and this should have been the absolute perfect courting gift. But when he gave it to me, I had to force a smile, because I didn't get the sense he gave it to me because I liked yellow roses. I felt like he gave it to me as a way to buy my interest. Again, I felt mean and silly, so pushed the thoughts away and displayed my new prize in a prominent place on my desk. Knowing I wanted to be a writer after the military, Jim told me his grandfather, whom he was named for, had written a popular book. I had never heard of a James Dickey before, so I just smiled and told him I thought it was really cool. I asked which book, and Jim did a double take. He paused, cleared his throat and mumbled, "I can't remember." I figured it might have sold poorly after all, and didn't pester him. Now I wish I had researched this book a bit more, because it might have made a difference. But then I was young and fairly obstinate, so I would have probably ignored that warning sign as well. Within days, Jim brought over a Super Nintendo and stored it at my place. This didn't bother me, as all my friends from the ship would leave valuables in my room. Joel left some expensive trinkets he'd acquired in the Philippines. Fear left Jade, and Cowboy even brought over his computer for safekeeping. The big problem I had with the Nintendo wasn't keeping it for Jim, it was Jim's use of it. If anyone came into the room at all while Jim was there, he immediately stopped talking to me and went to turn on either Final Fantasy II or Sim Earth. Everyone tried to include him in game and conversations, but he seemed to lose all interest in the games we used to play at the A Club. He wouldn't talk, not even greet people. As soon as we were no longer alone, Jim withdrew. I figured he was shy, but couldn't figure out why he'd become so badly shy when these were all our common friends. Cowboy, a real sweetheart with a serious alcohol problem. Elf, a Blackfoot shaman. Seal, a pacifist who couldn't pass the SEAL exams. All people he'd known from before the engagement. Even my corpseman friends had trouble talking to him, though they tried their best. Chris, who worked the emergency room on third shift and lived on the first floor overlooking the water, was the kind of guy who would get anyone to laugh or relax. But even Chris's legendary charms had no effect with Jim. I went through 2 roommates, but Jim was as antisocial when it came to females as he was with males. Sometime in July of 1992, Jim and I went out walking holding hands. We saw a couple, apparently friends of Jim's, as he seemed eager to introduce us. Jim led me directly over to them and introduced me. He then said, "See, I can get anything I want. I even got her to agree to marry me." He seemed very pleased, but the other couple just looked nervous. They laughed it off, and the conversation somehow got onto the subject of God. Again, Jim acted oddly, this time saying, "Oh, I'm not God, but I can take him in a fight." I could see how freaked out the other couple was, so made some comment about Jim's sense of humor. Jim glanced at me quickly, then gave me an odd laugh and agreed he had been joking. The other couple walked away at that point. Even though it had been weird and uncomfortable, I was relieved Jim hadn't just ignored the other people, so let it go. July of 1992. Our hospital was put on a health fair. I worked in the gynecology department and volunteered to run the display for our clinic. I was told to do a display concerning domestic abuse, focusing on the domestic violence and how to spot it. Thus, when the day came, I set up the flyers and research and such, and sat down. Jim came over and sat behind the table without permission. My supervising nurse saw him and frowned, telling me he shouldn't be there. I covered for him by saying, "Oh, he's here to help, so men feel better about stopping to look over the information." She accepted that and handed him a clinic t-shirt to put on, so he'd look like he'd fit in. As the nurse walked away, Jim asked if I had to sit there all day. I told him I did, and he grew quiet, frowning. Finally, he picked up a flyer on the 10 most common signs of domestic abuse and began to peruse it. He seemed vastly absorbed in what he was reading. As I hadn't prepared the flyer, I had no idea what it said, so I grabbed one as well to read. My relationship with Jim fit 9 of those 10 signs. I worried that I might be facing something abusive, but then told myself that since he had never laid a hand on me, as the 10th sign was physical abuse, that my relationship must be the exception that proves the rule, and I put my worry to the back of my mind, but promised myself that if Jim ever tried to hit me, everything was over. I looked up to find Jim watching me intently, gave him a smile, and put down the pamphlet. He tossed his on the table and walked away. I didn't see him for the rest of the day, but felt relieved. Many little things, such as what I've already described, happened, but mainly he ignored everyone, including me, if we were not alone. Over the months, both of my sisters managed to resolve their situations, and I no longer needed to be their backups for child rearing. Rather than lift the responsibility from my shoulders, I became suicidal, thinking I was not needed. I felt like I would just be in the way, and I began walking in front of cars in the middle of the night in an attempt to die. Thus began my first round of counseling sessions. However, nothing in counseling prepared me for what would happen in the summer to fall of 1993. I think it was in July of 93, Jim came to my room to tell me that the Blue Ridge was shipping out to Vladivostok, Russia, for a few weeks. He said this was the first time an American ship would be allowed there since the Cold War had begun in the 1950s. I can't be certain anymore, as when last week I tried to look up those exact dates on a Blue Ridge duty assignment listing, the Blue Ridge was listed as having gone there in 1996, not 1992 or 3. At the time, I had no reason to doubt Jim and was very excited for him. He said he wanted to spend the night with me. Immediately, I got the uncomfortable feeling that Jim wanted to sexually assault me. Not have sex, but sexually assault me. I pushed the suspicious thoughts away, putting it down to my paranoia from PTSD, the war, and my still feelings of uneasiness. I agreed to let him spend the night at my room, since I currently didn't have a roommate, and told him to use my bed, which was in the far left corner tucked between my desk and a pair of tall entertainment centers. I would sleep in the empty bunk, which was open to the entire room and close to the light, situated on the unused desk. My bed was a typical bunk, while the other bed was raised a foot or so extra off the floor. He had tried to talk me into sleeping with him, but I said he had to rest for the duty tomorrow. I told him I didn't feel well and didn't want to get him sick. Finally, he grumbled an agreement and dropped into my bed behind the convenient barrier. I literally had to climb into the spare bunk, but did so, turned out the light, and settled back. As soon as the room was dark and I was comfortable, I began to drift off to sleep, though I could feel waves of anger and hate coming from the rear end of my bed. This troubled me, as I'm usually pretty good at detecting someone's mood. I thought maybe Jim was pissed at me, but I gradually became aware that the negative feelings were not coming from Jim. They were between us and aimed in Jim's direction. I felt like someone was standing by my head in a protective manner, thinking bad things at Jim to keep him at bay. That had never happened to me in my barracks room before, though it had happened other times, but that's not pertinent to this series of events, and it never had happened in Japan. I let my eyes drift shut, trying to ignore the hostile entity I knew was protecting me. Suddenly, the foot of the bed pressed down with someone's body weight. Whoever it was began to crawl up the bed over me. I was annoyed with Jim and a bit afraid of what he intended, and I called out, "Jim!" From the far corner, his voice, clear and awake, came back. "Yeah?" The body was still over me, and it wasn't the entity near my head, which was seemingly focused on Jim. I flipped on the light, and the mattress returned to normal. The feeling of a body over mine was gone. I was alone on my side of the barrier, calling out. I told Jim, "Never mind, I thought I heard something." How could I tell him what happened? Especially since the feeling of impending doom and sexual assault had come with a sensation of someone crawling into bed. I turned off the light, and the bed pressed down again. Someone began crawling up my body once again. Nervous, I called out for Jim, who answered from the other bed, just as awake as before. I flipped on the light, and the pressure left. Again, I told Jim I thought I heard something. I hesitantly turned out the light. Whoever it was returned, instantly crawling in from the foot of the bed. I didn't wait this time. I turned on the light, grabbed a robe, and sat at the desk with a book. Jim sat up, glared at me, and asked me what I was doing. I told him I couldn't sleep and would read a bit. He grumbled and turned over, falling asleep quickly. I stayed up all night, not daring to turn the light out or to go to bed. I knew that whomever had crawled into bed was trying to keep me up, and I knew that the second I drifted off, Jim would get to me. It wasn't a minor feeling, it was a dead, certain dread. I couldn't wait to get Jim out the room. In fact, that was the last time he was permitted to sleep over. Somehow, I didn't trust him. Shortly after the Blue Ridge returned from wherever they had gone, Jim and Cowboy came over. They discussed what movies they should watch. I wasn't feeling well, and I really just wanted to read quietly to myself. But I didn't feel right kicking out these guys who had been at sea for 2 weeks. Cowboy mentioned wanting to watch a horror movie, not my favorite genre, and Jim said he wanted it to be super scary. I put my foot down at that and said I didn't feel up to horror. I thought I would get nightmares. Jim suddenly frowned and turned to Cowboy and said, "Yeah, nothing horror. I might start acting weird." His pause was almost more disturbing than his words. I was instantly angry that, once again, he was using me as a way to manipulate people or claim his evilness, just like with that couple and several other times in our relationship. I squashed down my temper and merely told them, "Watch whatever, I'm reading a book." They left shortly after. A few days later, Cowboy and Jim showed up with one of our other friends, Elf. He's a Blackfoot shaman. Cowboy was drunk and, unfortunately, depressed. He opened my window and started trying to climb out to attempt suicide. Jim, thankfully, was quick enough to catch the guy and wrestle him to the ground. Elf locked the window and, frowning, said he could get Cowboy to sleep it off. So they put him in my corner bed, and soon enough Cowboy was sleeping. I don't recall how Elf did it, because the next bit trumps it in my memory. Elf mentioned being able to heal people and do psychic surgery. He mentioned that Cowboy needed some psychical help, but he had to wait until Cowboy was sober and could voluntarily participate. Jim asked if Elf could heal him, since he was feeling evil. Elf looked him over doubtfully and said that he was pretty sure he could help. Jim climbed onto the spare bunk and lay down with his eyes closed. I asked Elf what I could do, and he told me to stand back and watch. He told me to shut my eyes and look at Jim's aura and tell him what I saw. I did so and saw a murky green light enveloping Jim. His aura seemed off to me, but I didn't know why. I've never done much research on auras and didn't know how it should have looked like. Elf told me to keep my eyes closed as he prayed. He said that when he was done, Jim should have a white aura instead. It was a long time of Elf praying in his native language, and me trying to watch through closed eyes, before the green grew much smaller. Finally, Elf said it was over, but his voice sounded troubled. I wondered what had went wrong, because there was no white light, just a smaller murky green one in Jim's core. Elf loudly said he was too tired to do anything more that day, and asked how Jim felt. Jim sat up and claimed he felt like a new man. As Elf passed me on his way to leave, he whispered that the light only grew smaller, not changed. He nodded and said he couldn't fix it. Something was evil there. Elf left, and soon after Cowboy awoke, and Jim took him back to the ship. Again, I ignored the warning signs. I was engaged to the man, lonely and feeling useless and desperate. So I brushed aside the warnings from a full Blackfoot shaman that my fiancé was evil. I figured something merely went wrong, and I wouldn't worry about it. I don't recall Elf ever coming over after that. It was about this time that Cowboy started calling me practically every weekend. He would be drunk at the A Club and needed someone to bring him home. I inevitably ran out there to help my friend, and often Jim would come with me to fetch Cowboy. We'd bring him back to my room to sober up or sleep it off. Chris, my friend at the ER, told me I had to start calling an ambulance for Cowboy. He insisted that my going to get him only encouraged him to get drunk. Chris insisted Cowboy needed professional intervention to get better, not coddling. Cowboy called again, in August 1993, to ask for my help. Jim and I went to get him, much to Chris's disgust. We brought Cowboy back, and Cowboy locked himself in the bathroom. He then lay up against the door and started trying to cut his arms open with my safety razor. Finally, Chris and Jim got the door and pulled Cowboy out. We took him to the ER, and that was the last time I went to get him. I always called an ambulance for him after that, but this was significant to things to come. Cowboy didn't hurt himself too badly with the razor, but it had been quite evident that one of my friends trying to suicide would drive me to do whatever I could for him. Jim apparently never forgot that. September 1993 came, and I was assigned a new roommate. She was a 19-year-old girl named Yvette and came from East Los Angeles. When we first met, she bragged how she never locked her doors in her life because nothing ever scared her. That afternoon, Jim showed up for a few hours. When he left, Yvette immediately locked the door behind him. I laughed and teased her about never locking doors. She turned to me, her face pale and serious, and said, "I know you're engaged, but that man creeps me out." Startled, I began to mentally review my relationship and all the odd events. Painfully, I came to the decision that this tough girl I'd known for half a day was entirely correct. Jim was creepier than hell. It took a total stranger to point out to me what my own eyes could not. Later that week, I had told Jim that we should postpone the engagement to get to know each other a bit more, and that's when things got extremely scary, and the order of the events are a blur to me. Yvette worked third shift with Chris at the ER, while I worked first shift at a clinic. Thus, when Yvette got home in the morning, I would be leaving. One of us would lock the door, and I wouldn't come back until mid-afternoon. We'd spend some time with friends or whatever. Then Yvette would get ready and leave for work. One of us would lock the door. I'd go to bed at that time. One day, I got a call at the clinic just after noon. Yvette was hysterical and insisting I come home. I may have been military, but I managed to get permission to run back to my room, which was just outside the back of the hospital, as you might recall. When I got into the room, Yvette was crying and sitting on her bed. She explained that she had woken up around noon to find Jim in the room. He was messing with the stuff under my bed, but she couldn't tell exactly what he was doing. When he noticed that she was awake, he got up and walked over to her and started asking weird questions. He asked things like, "When do you leave for work? When do you get home? When does my fiancé leave for work? When does she get home? When are you alone? When is she alone?" She got more and more frightened until she finally managed to convince him that she had to sleep for work. He left and she locked the door. Then she called me. We weren't able to figure out who had forgotten to lock the door, so after that, we both made sure to check when leaving and entering. My supervisory corpsman called me into her office one day and, really annoyed, asked me about Jim giving me a VCR. Confused, I confirmed he had. She then said that Jim had called her in the middle of the night at home to ask where his VCR was. She didn't appreciate being woken up by him about something so stupid. I told her the VCR was a birthday gift. Yes, it was an engagement gift, but a gift was a gift, and I'm sure as hell wasn't going to give it back after he bugged my supervisor about it. She frowned and said she'd take care of things, and sent me back to work. I still don't know how he got her phone number. I didn't even have her number, and I worked for her. Until I changed clinics, he called every couple of days asking for his VCR, or asking if I knew where it was, but she always insisted to tell me that she was handling it. Then, I was switched to the general practice clinic, including sick call, and I didn't hear any more about the VCR for some time. Now Jim was terrorizing everyone I called a friend except Cowboy. While I was walking to lunch with Roy White, as we shared a lunch shift, Jim passed us in the hallway and elbowed Whitey in the face. He would regularly start beating on Seal, who would never fight back or even report it. Jim began trying to corner Chris at his front door practically every day, so Chris wound up using his window as a way to enter and leave his, thankfully, first-floor room. Finally, I got sick of this and told Jim that the engagement was off. I told him that we could still be friends if he left everyone alone, but I wasn't going to marry someone that behaved this way. He asked me why we couldn't talk about things, but I insisted that it wasn't going to help. He stepped up the terrorizing, but this time he would call my boss or corner Chris saying he wanted to talk to me. After only a few more days of this more intense terror for my friends, I met him at the clinic while I was working. My boss agreed to give me a few minutes to talk to him. I explained to Jim that I could see him for lunch the next day in the hospital gallery to talk, but it couldn't be before then. I was going to get a shower right after work, then go to dinner, then go meet my former nursing supervisor and our exercise group for our mandatory bi-weekly run. Afterwards, I'd be getting another shower and going directly to bed. Feeling I had explained my schedule precisely to him, I asked if he was okay with meeting me for lunch the next day. He agreed and left, frowning but quietly. When I got home from work, Jim was at my door. He asked me why I wouldn't talk to him. I sighed and again told him my precise schedule and that I couldn't meet him until the next day for lunch. I said he had an hour to talk to me then. He agreed and walked down the hall towards the inner steps, which led to the guard deck and hospital entrance. Yvette had gone out with friends, so I was alone at last. Relieved, I went to my room and began gathering my clothes for the shower. Not 5 minutes later, a knock came on the door. I answered it, and there stood Jim. He asked why I couldn't talk to him. Surprised and a bit annoyed, I explained my schedule once more, thinking that he was being especially stupid about the entire thing. I told him I really couldn't talk even at dinner, because my schedule that night only allowed for a 15-minute dinner break or I'd be late and the exercise group was mandatory. I shut the door and he walked away, and I began to strip for my shower. Walking into the stall, I turned on the water, testing it, and a knock came at the door. Stunned, I knew it was Jim. By then I wasn't annoyed, I was scared. Why couldn't he understand and let me go? I stayed in the shower, but turned off the water so I could hear. I didn't trust that he wouldn't be able to get in somehow. I still never fully reconciled who had left that door unlocked when he terrorized Yvette. For half an hour I stood shivering and nude in the shower, listening to Jim knock for a while, and then stop and start again and stop over and over. I don't know why I didn't get dressed or call security. Even seeing someone out of the corner of my eye in the stall with me didn't spook me, as I figured it was the same angry guy from the last night Jim slept over. I had never seen someone in the shower with me before, but that night there was someone there, though this time I was too scared to try and sense whatever the entity was feeling. I just stood there hugging myself, shivering wet, and scared to death. Finally, the knocking on the door was accompanied by a voice shouting, "Let me in, it's Chris." Suddenly, relief washed over me. The entity disappeared. I grabbed my clothes and put them on, not bothering to dry off. I unlocked the door, expecting to see Jim with Chris in the hall, but Chris was alone. I pulled him in and locked the door, tears streaming down my face. He asked the question I'd been hearing for the last week or more. "Why won't you talk to Jim?" I knew Chris was one of the people who despised Jim the most. He'd even told me, after the breakup, that he'd never liked Jim and had only been tolerant for my sake. That actually seemed to be a popular opinion amongst my corpseman friends. So I described to Chris the events of the day. Quietly, he offered to distract Jim while I ran out the back stairs to meet my exercise group, which I was late for. I took him up on the offer and watched him walk to the inside stairwell and talk to someone out there on the landing. That's when I knew Jim had been watching for me to leave the room and waiting. I was terrified. I ran out the door, forgetting to lock it, I'm sure, and headed down the outside steps. I ran full tilt to the row of shops where my group met, but no one was there. I had been so looking forward to being in a group, with safety. Turning, I started up Officers Hill, where the Married Officers BOQ, or housing, was, but realized that Jim knew my running route, and being the fastest runner on the Blue Ridge, would have no problem catching me up. I was terrified that he would find me, though I had no idea what he might do, but I didn't want to be alone with him to find out. Turning back down the hill, I ran along the water road towards the hospital. taking the risk that Jim had either gone to find me en route or was still on the inside landing and therefore couldn't see me run past the barracks. I ran past the hospital and down the front drive, heading the reverse of the running route, hoping to meet up with my group. I was never so glad to see my lieutenant supervisor as I was in that moment. I ran over to her, ignoring the group, and told her what had happened. She dismissed everyone else and had me tell her again, slowly. Finally, she said the one thing I didn't want to hear. "You're overreacting. Go home and rest. It'll be fine. There's no reason to be afraid. You're taking it out of context." It was like she had slapped me in the face. Shocked, I turned and went home, making sure to use the outside steps to get to my floor, just in case. I locked myself in and cried. The next day, I reported sick instead of working and was permitted to go back to my room to rest. The new supervisors understood what had happened without my even telling them. I never got over what the lieutenant had said. Later, I found out she had gone immediately to security and reported Jim's stalking behavior, as well as telling my new supervisors. She was terrified for me. In fact, she'd only said what she did to try and calm me down, because she had never encountered a stalker before. But she didn't calm me down that day. Instead, she broke my trust. That day, Jim did not show up to our lunch appointment, though I did leave my room to show for it. He came by later, but I told him we couldn't be friends since he couldn't trust me. I told him I'd missed dinner and my mandatory exercise because of him, and was in trouble at work. He said nothing and left. Then I felt immense relief. It was finally over. Little did I know, it was only the calm before the storm. Thursday of that week, late September, I was sitting watch desk for the barracks. This watch runs until 11:30 at night, but I would often stay down there, still in uniform, until 1 in the morning, talking with friends or playing pool in the next door lounge area. That night was no different, as I felt safer in the crowd. Scott and Ron, 2 other corpsman friends, were there as well with Seal. Cowboy was on restriction for a drunken rampage in Guam, so I hadn't seen him for a few days. Chris and Yvette were on yet another midnight shift. Another more casual corpsman acquaintance was there. His name was Dave, and he was fairly new to the duty station. We were talking and laughing, and having general fun in a restricted kind of way since I was on duty. Basically, I got to sit at a desk and do a roving patrol every hour. Jim suddenly showed up, and the mood shifted to somber. It felt as if the guys were gathering round me protectively, without even leaving their seats. I think Ron was even sitting on the desk, filing his nails. Jim said he needed to talk to me in private, so I took him to the next room, which was the general lounge and phone room. I left the door open so the others were really close. He wanted to shut the door, but I told him he had to leave it open since I was on watch and technically shouldn't even leave the desk. He said he was sorry for what had happened between us, and that he was depressed. He felt like he was in danger and needed company back to the ship. I said okay, and went back to the other room, and asked if someone would be willing to walk Jim back to the ship. Nobody spoke up, and Jim frowned and said he wanted me to walk him to the ship. I told him I couldn't do that because I was on watch, and he said he felt like he might walk in front of cars or something. I was instantly terrified. I felt like he was trying to get me alone, to sexually assault me or perhaps kill me. For the first time in my life, the thought that he actually might kill me came up. I insisted I wasn't allowed to leave, and that I was extended late that night due to some thefts in the barracks. Instantly, Ron, Scott, and even Dave piped up in support of my lie. Bless those men. I told Seal to please walk Jim home, even though I knew Jim would beat the living shit out of Seal for interfering. But I felt Seal being beaten up was better than me getting murdered, so I squashed my guilt and insisted. Seal, ever the consummate gentleman, stood to obey my direct plea. Jim got angry and said he did not need Seal babysitting him, and I asked if Jim felt like he was in danger. No, I'll go by myself. You'll regret this. Jim left. Then I asked Seal to follow him to make sure he got home safe. Seal agreed and left, but was very unhappy. I wondered if I had lost a friend that night. Finally, 11:30 came back around and I went to my room, instead of hanging out longer. Not much later, a knock came to the door. It was Seal. He wanted to talk to me. We spent the entire night talking and playing with Cowboy's computer. When the dawn came, Seal seemed stunned and claimed he had to muster. He opened the door, and Yvette stood there looking exhausted, holding her keys out. She smiled at Seal. Everyone liked Seal, and passed him as she walked out. She looked at me and I said, "We talked all night. Jim tried to get me to go with him last night. I'm going to bed." I rolled into my bed and took off my glasses, which instantly blurred the room. I heard Yvette unzip her ER jumpsuit, which I knew she only wore undies underneath, and she kicked off her shoes, and then another knock came to the door. I called out, "Seal probably forgot something. Give him whatever it is and tell him I'm asleep." I couldn't see anything but a blur of colors. I heard her open the door and say, "Oh, it's you." She sounded utterly disgusted. "Is she home?" Jim said. I stiffened and pretended to be asleep, eyes closed and breath held. Yvette paused, sounding less hostile, and answered, "No, she's asleep. What do you want?" "Never mind." Immediately, Yvette screamed, "Jim!" and took off running out of the door in socks and an unzipped jumpsuit in near nudity. I crammed my glasses on and opened the window, not knowing what had happened. I saw Seal in the parking lot and screamed, "Seal, catch Jim!" Yeah, it would be useless for him to try. As I said, Jim was the fastest runner on the Blue Ridge at the time, but I didn't think about that. I turned away from the open window as Seal bolted off. Yvette limped back in and said that Chris was also chasing Jim. She zipped her jumpsuit up and shoved her feet into her sneakers. She then glared in my direction, but I don't think she was glaring at me specifically. She said, "He slit his wrists." Yvette ran back out the door. I picked up the room phone and called an ambulance, and I tried to explain that Jim had slit his wrists and was stationed on the Blue Ridge, but he ran off and I wasn't exactly sure where he was. They took the information down, and after a while told me they couldn't do anything without his location. They said to try security, but to call back if Jim showed up. Yvette came back and I tried security again, just as Chris and the next door neighbor, a new guy called John, came in. Security already knew about Jim from the ambulance crew, and told me they had dogs searching for him. He was considered armed and dangerous. I was stunned and said that Jim wasn't known to carry a knife until that day. They told me they'd stay in touch. Seal came back in, late for muster, and panting hard. He said that he had lost Jim, but that Jim had turned off towards the Blue Ridge. I passed the info to security and hung up. That's when I noticed Chris was swearing. John asked what had happened. Yvette said, Crysty was in bed trying to sleep when Jim showed up. He's her ex-boyfriend. I opened the door and he slit his wrists and then asked for Krista, which is what he calls her. I didn't see any blood, so I told him she was asleep. Then he said never mind and turned, but as he turned I saw blood. He bolted and I tried to stop him, but I was only in socks. Chris swore again and said, "Slit his wrists, my ass. I'll show him how to slit his wrists. I'll show him how to slit his throat." Chris's feet were bare, and I could only imagine the pain of running outside after a man he despised. Seal sighed and apologized, but said he was already late to muster and had to leave. We let him go. Not long after, a knock came to the door. Chris opened it. It was Jim, looking very calm. Chris dragged him in and began taking care of the injury, which was actually on the fleshy part of Jim's palm, and so was not in the least bit dangerous to him. This seemed to piss Chris off even more, and he kept swearing but very softly. He was the ultimate professional in treating Jim's wound. He asked where the knife was, and Jim claimed to have lost it. Jim then mentioned that he'd washed his wrist off in a bucket of green liquid somewhere. Chris gave him a startled look, which turned into a glare, and he stated, "Not antifreeze." Jim guessed he was right. John said he had to go next door for something and left. After a brief pause, I said I needed to ask John something and went next door. Without knocking, I walked in and used his phone to call security, ignoring a rather embarrassed John who was using the bathroom. Poor guy must have thought he'd moved next to the loony bin. Security was surprised when I told them Jim had returned without the knife that he claimed. They said that they were just entering the first floor guard area, and they were on their way up. They ordered me to get everyone out the room and leave Jim in there. I went back next door, where Jim was sitting on the floor, with a box of Sunday comic clippings my mother had sent me. He was reading calmly. Without my having to say anything, Chris and Yvette left, taking John with them, and heading for the lounge. I sat down, not wanting Jim to leave before security could get there. After a long moment, Jim nonchalantly said, "This is your fault. I told you something would happen. You should have gone with me last night. It's your fault I'm hurt." I didn't know what to say, and still don't know if I responded at all. I knew he was playing on my sympathy for depressed friends, on my own suicidal ideations. Hell, he'd even used my own suicide attempts against me by claiming he felt like walking out in front of cars the night before. Fortunately, security showed up and kicked me out the room. They made me go to the lounge while they arrested Jim. They took him to the hospital and had him admitted to the psych ward for observation. If all went well and the doctors felt him safe, Jim would be released at noon next day. I was utterly convinced that would never happen. One of the security guards, military police actually, told me I needed to get a restraining order against Jim. He was adamant I'd do this. Then I was left alone and decided maybe I should take his advice. I'd go on Monday when the office opened. Unfortunately, the next day, a Saturday, the phone ringing woke me up. Yvette had just gotten home, so it was perhaps 7:30 or so. I answered, and it was Dave on the morning barracks watch. He asked if Jim had anything in my room. Confused, I told him that Jim had Nintendo, games, and movies there. Dave went on to explain that Jim was asking for his stuff. He said he'd distract him while I got it together. I checked the clock. There was no way it was noon. He couldn't have been released already. Panicking, I started collecting his things. Yvette helped me, and we brought these things down the inside stairs. Dave stopped us on the landing of the second floor. He wouldn't let us go any further and took the stuff. Just as he took the stuff down to Jim, security showed up and arrested him again. Since I didn't have a restraining order, the charge was escaping the psych ward. He had actually broken out the ward to come back to my place. The same security guard from the day before was angry and asked me why I hadn't gotten an order against him. I told him I was doing it on Monday, but the office would have been closed the night before. The guard informed me that the office was open at all times for something like this, and he insisted I go down and get the order right then and there. I went to the office and got the order. Most restraining orders are for 100 feet or 300 yards. He mentioned that he had given me the 300 yards or 900 feet, and that Jim wouldn't be allowed on the same street, even across the road from me. I figured that was normal, and thanked him, relieved that I had this order. By the time I got home, Dave told me that Jim was being confined to the psych ward on the Blue Ridge for at least a week. He asked if I was sure I got everything of Jim's, and I told him I was positive. The next day, Sunday, I brought a badly beaten seal with me to the security office to get a restraining order. But at the last minute, he balked. They wouldn't give it to him unless he signed, and he refused because Jim was a higher rank. Seal was odd like that. He wouldn't disobey anyone of a higher rank, even if the order was abusive. 2 days later, I finally got to see Cowboy, who was troubled by everything he'd heard from Jim. He said Jim had told him we'd broken up. Cowboy had repeatedly encouraged him to get me to talk to him and not give up. I was horrified. Poor Cowboy had been behind Jim, continually harassing everyone, but he didn't even know it. I knew Jim would never explain the truth, so I did, keeping nothing back, letting Cowboy know what his best friend had been doing for the past few months. Cowboy was horrified and began to cry. I forgave Cowboy. Jim had used him. On the 4th day of Jim's incarceration, I was jogging by the ships, secure in the knowledge that Jim wouldn't be out of there to harass me. A young man in dungarees was also running, and he said hello to me. I politely struck up a conversation, and it turned out he was a corpsman from the Blue Ridge. I hesitantly asked if he knew a man by the name of Jim Dickey, fishing for information on how the psych thing was going, trying to gauge my safety. The corpsman snorted and said he knew Jim, and he'd been watching him in the psych ward for the last 3 days. He went on to say, "That bitch who got him locked up lied. He's not crazy. He's perfectly calm and sane and a really nice guy." I broke into instant tears and practically yelled, "I'm not a liar." I then went on to tell this guy exactly what Jim had put me through. The corpsman seemed stunned and soberly said, "I already signed off his release early last night." I hightailed it back to my room and locked myself in, terrified the entire thing would start again. I no longer felt like the order would protect me. Jim was being transitioned out of the Navy at this point for what he did to me. He was supposed to get on a plane and leave for the States to process out, but delayed this for more than a month. He kept re-injuring his toe. I think he deliberately hurt himself, and he was in the sick call clinic every 3 days. Fortunately, the staff knew about what was happening. Every time his name showed up on a sick call, the ship always had to send a list before it could send the people. I was assigned to help out at a different clinic, or in supply of something. I felt like I would never get away from this horror. And finally, November 17th, 1993, a Friday came around. Now, I was shipping out to the States to process out. I figure I would never have to deal with Jim again. While packing, I found Jim's military ID and social security cards under my bed, but I merely tucked them in my purse, figuring he'd replace them by then. I was not going to be hunted down to return them, and I never thought to simply hand them into security. I left to go to the bus terminal. Waiting for the bus to take me to the airport, I sat reading a book. Suddenly, someone dropped something in my lap. I didn't look up right away, instead picking up the object and looking it over. My blood ran cold. It was my father's business card. Hesitantly, I flipped it over, and on the back were written instructions on how to get to my parents' house from the airport. I looked up, but saw no one near me and no sign of Jim. I knew it had been Jim. This was the card I gave him when I told him I wanted to get married at home. It hit me. Jim had walked right over to me, and no one had stopped him. Despite still being in Japan, no one in that terminal had known about the restraining order. He could have done anything. The bus was called, and I practically ran to climb aboard. I shook so hard I had trouble with my bags, sitting in the back seat, shaking. I looked out the window just as the bus began to move, and there, leaning on a tree next to my window, arms crossed and grinning, was Jim. I began crying, but kept watching until he was out of sight, not wanting to take my eyes off him, just in case. Arriving in Treasure Island, California, an island close to Alcatraz, I felt such freedom. I wasn't put on a duty until Tuesday, since I had arrived on a weekend, and Monday was taken with processing medical and payroll and other paperwork. I had also been told that I wouldn't be able to go home until next week, as Thursday was Thanksgiving, and no one was processed out before a holiday. So Tuesday, I called my mum to let her know I wouldn't be making it for Thanksgiving. The phone stood at the front door to the security building, so anyone walking up would need to pass the phone in order to report to the master-at-arms at the desk. As I talked to my mum, I got an odd feeling, one I still cannot describe. I turned around and there he was. He walked up to me and passed by me within a hand's breadth, the biggest shit-eating grin on his face. He turned and walked back downstairs and disappeared into the crowd of workers doing groundskeeping and stuff. I screamed and began to cry and shake and babble incoherently. Mum on the other side of the line asked what happened, and I told her something like, "Jim's here, I gotta go." I dropped the phone and ran to the security desk. I pulled out the ID cards and slapped them on the desk. I know you aren't supposed to tell me who checks in, but I gotta know. Did James Vernon Dickey just check in today? You see, I had a restraining order on him in Japan, and now we're in California, and I don't think it works anymore. The MMA, a tall, well-built man, went pale. He took the cards and checked the roster and slowly said, "Yes, he did. Let me talk to my supervisor." Then the man took off, running, leaving the security desk and the building unguarded. It felt like hours, but could only have been seconds, when he returned and gave me a pass to talk to my temporary supervisor upstairs. I don't know if he still had those cards, and I didn't care. I took the pass and went up. My supervisor listened to the entire story, then left. He was gone for over an hour, but it felt like longer. But it certainly was an hour. When he returned, he looked serious. He ordered me into his private office and to sit down. I sat and waited. He then told me that he'd checked out my story and spoken to Jim and his temporary supervisor. Jim was in a different section from me. I can't recall if my supervisor said 2 or 6, and would have no reason to come near me. He then went on to explain that Jim's section was for the really bad guys, the ones being processed out for being dangerous and such. He told me that I was not the only person Jim had done this to, but I was the only one who had carried through and gotten a restraining order. That restraining order had allowed the military to process Jim out as a bad boy. The supervisor went on to explain that my lieutenant back in Japan had first reported him, the nurse that told me I was overreacting. Then the ambulance crew, the security crew, and the hospital had also reported things. He said that the reason the dogs had been sent to look for Jim that day, when he'd slit his hand, was that he was considered highly dangerous, and security had not been exaggerating. Finally, my supervisor said that when he spoke to Jim and Jim's supervisor, he told Jim in no uncertain tones that if Jim so much as blinked at me, he wouldn't know what hit him. My supervisor went on to soundly threaten Jim in the most polite, legal way he could. He asked if my paperwork was in process, and said I'd be excused from all duties until they were finished. I confirmed that I was only waiting for payroll to finish. Everything else had been done on Monday. He told me that he tried to get me out by Friday, but that Thanksgiving, being a Thursday, would hold me back a couple of days. I understood and told him so. He gave me a special pass to let me eat with the officers, so I wouldn't run into Jim at the gallery. Finally, I left and went back to the all-female barracks. Wednesday morning at muster, I was surprised when my name was called with two men who had been there over a week. I was handed plane tickets and told that I would be leaving that night. I made it back home to Vermont at 9 in the morning on Thanksgiving. 27 years have passed, and I still freak out when I hear someone knock. As an afternote, a few months after getting home, I was going through Mum's storage boxes of books, inherited from numerous relatives over the years, and I stumbled upon the book written by Jim's grandfather, James Dickey. It was called Deliverance. My mum says if she had known, she would have warned me to avoid him like the plague. I hope I would have listened. Heroes don't make history. It is history that makes heroes. Jeddo Suikin III. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Well done for making it all to the end. I hope that all of you guys enjoyed. I do think that last story was absolutely epic. I really, really enjoyed it, and hope that you guys did as well. All the stories were great. Crazy exes really do be crazy. Anyway, if you did enjoy the video, don't forget to drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts, as that always helps me out a bunch. And if you're new here, subscribe and press the bell icon to be notified every time I post. If there's a story you would like read on the channel, post it to my Reddit or send it to my email. But for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.